The disturbing case of John Wayne Gacy. Amidst the tranquility of suburban life, an ordinary man concealed a dark secret, casting a shadow over the lives of countless individuals. John Wayne Gacy, with an outward charm that masked his true nature, was anything but the good man everyone believed him to be. Behind closed doors, he was a monster, and when the truth finally came out, the depths of human depravity shocked the world. Most serial killers often have a reason for how they turned out, but there was no logic to the actions of Gacy. In this video, we delve into the intricate layers of John Wayne Gacy's psyche, shedding light on the disturbing acts that stained the very essence of humanity. Prepare yourself for this gripping exploration of the human condition, which will test your understanding, leaving a mark on your soul.
We have reason to believe that he's a maniac.
I don't accept the whole situation.
Sentenced Leroy Bundy to die in the electric chair.
Brother and sister.
As the cadence of the investigative waves suspected Francis trouble.
Seeds of Darkness, uncovering the early years. Just like other serial killers of the 1900s, John Wayne Gacy had a complicated childhood. He was the middle child, having an older and younger sister, both 2 years apart. His father, John Sr., a violent drunk, was the son of Polish immigrants and was a World War I veteran who, post-war, worked as a mechanic and a handyman. Gacy's family was nothing but troubling, like the recorded event in 1944. His younger sister had just been born, and what was supposed to be a family dinner turned into a struggle for life when John Sr. suddenly tossed hot food from the table onto the face of his wife, Maren Gacy, and punched her so hard that she broke her nose. Maren, sensing danger, ran out of the house to save herself, and John Sr. followed after. He only stopped after a neighbor intervened. He went back into the house, took a gun, and would disappear for days, of most likely heavy drinking. John Sr. was a wife-beater. Maren and John Sr. reconciled, but it wasn't over. John Sr. physically abused his household with leather straps, both whether they made mistakes or not. So much so that when his coworker molested Gacy, the boy didn't bother to report it. He was beaten so often that he soon after found a hiding place and a place for solace in the crawlspace of their house. He used it to hide things. He found it fascinating. This habit became significant in his killings. The psychological effects began to subtly manifest. John had developed a paranoia about loud noises, sirens, fire trucks, and crime reports, among other things. This caused him to be bullied by his classmates. He was already easy prey. Gacy was chubby and allegedly had heart issues, which made him unfit for sports. His father wanted a manly child, so to his father, he was a disappointment. In time, John Wayne Gacy suddenly started getting violent fits, where he would scream. He was admitted to a hospital and almost permanently put into a mental institution. Between the ages of 12 and 18, Gacy spent his time in and out of hospitals. Gacy grew up eventually, and so did his body. One day, he was able to stand up to his father and prevent him from beating his mother. He trapped his father against a wall. Being so close to his father and being able to trap and overpower him got him aroused. Gacy, like his father, worked hard. He began to work delivering groceries, mowing lawns, and repairing houses in his neighborhood. He had a talent for business, and in his vocational school, he became the star student. That's not all. He also was a civil defense captain. and he worked in church organizations, even considering becoming a priest, as the vow of chastity would hide his bisexuality. All these made him popular, but this would not last, as his health got in the way of his ambition and he dropped out of his vocational school. The double life. Gacy soon went to a business school, worked for a management company, and not long after moved out of his parents' house into his own in Springfield, Illinois. He started dating, and not long after became a member of the United States Junior Chamber of Commerce. He was doing well for himself. He had a personality that made you want to listen to him and talk to him. He used it to his advantage and secured his place in society. He would soon find out about the wife-swapping, pornography distribution, and prostitute ring that he and his colleagues would become heavily involved in. After 6 months in Springfield, he married his first wife, Marilyn Meyer, who was from a well-off family. He would have 2 children with her. His life seemed to be going perfectly. He was a respectable man. The shadow. Gacy had another side of him that was just terrible. He picked up young people and was openly sexual with them. One time when he was driving to work, he encountered 15-year-old Donald Voorhees walking. He offered the boy a ride and managed to convince him to go home, where he showed him pornographic videos. He performed oral sex on Donald and told Donald to do the same to him. Donald kept returning to his house to ask for money. They were exchanging sex for money. This despicable act would not be a one-time thing, as between 1967 and 1968, he would participate in sexual acts with minors several more times. He would pay some to have relations with his wife in exchange for money and would later blackmail them into having sex with him. Donald's demands for money soon became more frequent, and when Gacy got tired of his demands, the boy told his father. This led to a police investigation where his house was searched. They found porn, just like Donald said, but there was barely enough to charge him with. He took a polygraph test to prove his alleged innocence, but failed it. He still had the backing of his colleagues, who didn't want their activities involving wife swapping, pornography distribution, and prostitution to be exposed. This took an interesting turn when other victims began to surface. Edward Lynch, an employee of his father-in-law's restaurant, testified to being forced by Gacy to watch porn. Gacy wanted to have sex with him and had cut him with a knife when Edward refused and fought back. Gacy responded by choking him till he lost consciousness. Edward was freed and soon after fired from his job. On the 10th of May, 1968, John Wayne Gacy was arrested and charged with sodomy of a teenage boy. He denied all charges, claiming it was efforts made by his opponents to prevent him from being president of the Junior Chamber of Commerce. He got the support of a lot of people because of the reputation he had built. He once again took a polygraph test and failed. And at this point, he changed his testimony. He claimed Donald was a prostitute, and he decided to try it once, but he was being blackmailed by him for money. Gacy was then released and rearrested for intimidation and burglary. He had hired 18-year-old Russell Schrader to intimidate and beat Donald to stop him from testifying. During his arrest, he sang out loud about his wife swapping, pornography distribution, and prostitute ring he and his colleagues were involved in. A few more boys came out as victims of Gacy in just a few months. Gacy was psychologically and physically evaluated, and it showed that he never had any heart conditions. He discovered he had a high IQ and was a smooth talker. He also lacked empathy and conscience. He thought he would be free to go, but he was found guilty of sodomy and sentenced to 10 years in jail. John Sr. cried when his son was sentenced, most likely out of shame than out of sadness. During all this, his wife divorced him and took custody of his children. Gacy's time in prison. Gacy's personality led to him rising to the position of head cook in prison. He was a model prisoner, and he related well with the inmates and the prison guards. In prison, he had spread a lot of lies about himself in the hope of helping his reputation. He told everyone he was a prominent politician in prison for showing porn to 17-year-olds. He claimed his ex-wife was the daughter of Colonel Sanders, the founder of the KFC franchise. His wife's father had bought 3 KFC locations. He also told lies about serving in the Marines. He was able to fool many of the inmates. He maintained his stance on having a heart condition and acted like he hated homosexuality in prison. No records of him being involved in homosexuality in prison were noticed. He even took the chance to get a high school diploma. Gacy was released only after a year and a half. But during his time in incarceration, John Sr. had passed away from liver cirrhosis. Life after prison. After being released, he relocated back to Chicago, Illinois, and started his trade on a clean slate. He moved in with his mother and began to work as a cook at a dive bar. At one point, he grew tired of his job as a cook and started a PDM contractor company. Not long after, proof that he had not turned a new leaf surfaced. He was charged with sexually assaulting a teenager. This case was dropped as the victim never showed up again. He lied to cover up his tracks by saying he was instead charged with beating up a homosexual. In one of his PDM jobs, he would meet his colleague's roommate, who told Gacy that he was gay. They both had sex and got talking. His colleague's roommate showed him a few spots to pick up male prostitutes. Gacy would make good use of this information as he picked up a number of his victims here. Time went by. On the 15th of August 1971, he moved into his infamous house at 8213 West Somerdale Avenue with his mother. Mickle Reed, one of his employees that lived with him and had sex with him, was attacked by Gacy on a few occasions, one of them with a hammer. Mickle got scared and moved out. Gacy rekindled his romance with Carol Lofgren, a girl that he had dated back in high school. She had already gone through a divorce and had 2 daughters. She had financial issues, and although she wasn't so much in love with Gacy, she married him for stability. Gacy had told her he was bisexual, but she did not take it seriously. December 25th, 1971, Gacy visited his father's grave, and it is said that he cried for a long time. It would seem that day something else inside him had broken, as just weeks later, he would begin to murder teenagers. He married Carol Lofgren on the 1st of July, 1972, but it was important to know that just 9 days before their wedding, he was arrested for sexual battery. He had impersonated a police officer, kidnapped a teenager, and forced him to have oral sex with him. At the traffic light stop, the boy ran out of the car, and Gacy tried to run him over. The victim had tried to blackmail him for money. This led to the police dropping the case. Another double life. Gacy maintained a clean public appearance and got back into politics. He became secretary-treasurer of Norwood Park Light Committee. He used his company to clean the Democratic Party's local headquarters, and this fetched him a good reputation. He was also the director of Chicago's annual Polish Constitution Day Parade and a member of the Moose Launch fraternity. He was well respected in his community. He started dressing himself up as the famous alias Pogo the Clown. The clown has a creepy-looking smile, but somehow His duties to the company fetched him more attention. He acted as entertainment at Christmas, Halloween, and Easter parties. He also visited sick kids in hospitals and performed at parades. He did things as a clown he could not do on normal days. Gacy had successfully made a place for himself in society. Sometimes the best hiding place is in the light. In 1977, he became a precinct captain and even took a picture with the First Lady of the United States of America. Gacy kept abducting and killing young teenage boys, some that worked for him, others that were male prostitutes, and also people that he met randomly. He made sure to choose his victims carefully, people who had no one to look for them if they went missing. It was very surprising that the police had not looked closely at Gacy. Teenage boys around him kept disappearing, and he had a history of being a sexual predator. He got a lot of sexual molestation charges, but none were prosecuted. His marriage was failing. Carol felt he had spent too much time working. Little did she know he had not actually spent the time working, but raping, torturing, and murdering boys. She told him to quit PDM contractors as it was taking too much of his time. In October 1975, Carol divorced him based on infidelity. He fell into taking drugs and pills and made his place a co-housing unit. David Cram, one of his employees, would move in with him. When he attempted to rape him several times, Cram got so scared that he started sleeping in jeans with a belt on and no longer pajamas. After being attacked by Pogo the Clown, he moved out. The next person would be Michael Kors of his company, who was more willing to play along with Gacy. He even dressed as a clown, Patches, and had sex with Gacy, but even he would get worried and move out. Gacy dressed up as a police officer and arrested Robert Donnelly. He raped him and choked him. Pointing a gun at his head, he played Russian roulette with him. He would keep pulling the trigger once he pulled a blank. It was enough to scare Donald. He then took him home to submerge him in water while talking in a high-pitched Pogo the Clown voice. Donald reported but was not believed. He was an addict with mental issues, and Gacy was a respected member of society. Jeff Rignall, 26 years old, had just argued with his girlfriend because he was more into having sex with men despite his relationship. Gacy met him on the way to a gay club and offered him a car ride. Gacy offered him a puff of his marijuana, which Jeff accepted. He was offered once more, but this time was met with a rag of chloroform, which made him pass out. He gained consciousness a few times, but kept being knocked out at intervals with chloroform. He then woke up. He was on a couch in a building smelling of rotted flesh. He was once more offered a puff of marijuana, which he accepted out of fear, and was doused with chloroform once more. He would then be raped and abandoned in the snow. It is still a mystery why he let him go, but Jeff was bruised, beaten, scarred, burned, and his liver was badly damaged beyond repair from the chloroform. Even though he filed a report, nothing was done by the police because he admitted to being gay. Method of operation. John Wayne Gacy possessed a chilling ability to manipulate those around him, utilizing his deceptive charm that belied his sinister intentions. His method of operation involved targeting vulnerable individuals, particularly young men and teenage boys, who were often drawn to his charismatic personality. Gacy would present himself as a pillar of the community, a successful businessman, and an active member of local organizations, engendering his trust and admiration among his peers. He would exploit their vulnerabilities, promising them opportunities for employment, guidance, or even a place to stay. Most of his targets were young men and boys, often in their late teens or early 20s, whom he believed he could overpower with relative ease. Many of Gacy's victims were from marginalized backgrounds, individuals who had been ostracized or struggled with homelessness or strained family relationships. He preyed upon their desperate need for stability and a sense of belonging, and the promise of a brighter future. Once he gained their trust, he would invite them to his residence, often for a social gathering or to discuss potential job opportunities. However, what awaited them within the confines of his home was rape, torture, and most times, death. The investigation and trial. Finally, it would seem Gacy's life of crime was up, and repercussions for his actions finally caught up to him. Robert Piest, a model student, went missing. He was meant to celebrate his mom's birthday along with her. His mother waited, but he was never to return. Robert had informed his mother that he was with a contractor discussing work, and that the contractor would drive him back. The contractor was none other than John Gacy. A missing persons report was filed, and a manhunt was commissioned. Gacy was investigated, and his records were looked through, and his jail time records showed his crimes. This led the detectives to be more aggressive with their digging, and a search warrant was issued. In his house, they discovered gay porn, drugs, police badges, handcuffs, restraining devices, big plastic dildos, a blue parka, and a pharmacy receipt in his waste bin. A blood stain was on the bathroom floor. The crawl space caught their attention, but it was obvious that it wasn't dug recently, so they ignored it. Interviews with his employees led to David Cram narrating his experience with Gacy. He said he believed bodies were buried in the crawl space, and Gacy had always called them to dig holes in the crawl space with specific instructions. Gacy was then put on 24-hour surveillance. On further investigation, the blue parka, containing a receipt, belonged to Robert Piest, and was enough to process a second warrant. It had placed Robert Piest in his house. When the detectives were invited into Gacy's house, one of them went shopping around and noticed a putrid smell. He flushed the toilet, and the smell of rotting flesh came up once more from the house vent. He knew at that moment that he had to get a warrant to check out the crawl space. Not long after discussing with Michael Koss, Gacy went to see his lawyers. He confessed his crimes to them, and the crawl space was to be dug. It was found flooded, and the water was being drained. At this point, Gacy was having a mental breakdown. He paid for gas at a gas station with marijuana, and he begged to see his father's grave. Gacy was arrested under the pretext of marijuana possession. He had to be locked up somehow, and not long after, his crawl space was dunked. Bones were discovered. 27 bodies were found in his crawl space, one beneath his garage and one more under his patio. The bodies had ropes around their necks, gags in their mouths, metal rods, and pill bottles in their anuses. On the 22nd of December 1978, he confessed to the murders. He couldn't even recall most of their names. He confessed he lacked more space to dump more recent bodies and had thrown them in the Des Plaines River. His victims. 3 bodies were found linked to him, but the rest were never recovered. His identified victims include Timothy Jack McCoy, 16, murdered on January 3, 1972. Randall Wayne Reffitt, 15, murdered on May 14, 1976. Samuel G. Dodd Stapleton, 14, murdered on May 14, 1976. Michael Lawrence Bonin, 17, murdered on June 3, 1976. William Huey Carroll, 16, murdered on the 13th of June, 1976. James Byron Hackinson, 16, murdered on August 5, 1976. Rick Lewis Johnston, 17, murdered on August 6, 1976. Kenneth Ray Parker, 16, murdered on October 24, 1976. Michael M. Marino, 14, murdered on October 24, 1976. William George Bundy, 19, murdered on October 26, 1976. Francis Wayne Alexander, 21, murdered on December 1, 1976. Gregory John Godzik, 17, murdered on December 12, 1976. John Allen Schick, 19, murdered on January 20th, 1976. John Stephen Prestige, 20, murdered on March 15th, 1977. Matthew Walter Bowen, 19, murdered on July 5th, 1977. Robert Edward Gilroy Jr., 18, murdered on September 15th, 1977. John Anthony Mowry, 19, murdered on September 25th, 1977. Russell Lloyd Nelson, 21, murdered on October 17th, 1977. Robert David Winch, 16, murdered on November 10th, 1977. Tommy Joe Balling, 20, murdered on November 18th, 1977. David Paul Talsma, 19, murdered on December 9th, 1977. William Wayne Kindred, 19, murdered on February 16th, 1978. They were all found buried in his crawl space. Timothy David O'Rourke, 20, murdered on June 16th to the 23rd, 1978. Frank William Landigan, 19, murdered on November 4th, 1978. James Mazzara, 20, murdered on November 24th, 1978. Robert Jerome Peast, 15, murdered on December 11th, 1978, found in Plain River. John Putkovich, 18, murdered on July 31st, 1975, was found in the garage. And Daryl Julius Sampson, 18, murdered on April 6th, 1976, was found under the dining room. It was said that Gacy had most likely killed around 45 people. Some of the bodies found under his building were even rotten beyond identification. The Trial, a Circus of Horrors. John Wayne Gacy claimed insanity. He claimed he had paranoia, schizophrenia, and multiple personality disorder. He claimed he had 4 personalities: the contractor, the politician, the clown, and the policeman. As he stood trial for 33 murders, he claimed that the suffocations were accidental from erotic asphyxiation. This didn't make sense, as some were strangulations, and there was even a stabbing case. To disprove his claim, it was obvious most of the men were straight, and he was himself when directing his employees on where in the crawl space to dig. Thus, digging was for new spaces for coming victims, not the dead victims. He painted himself as a victim of homosexuality and sadistic impulses. Pictures of his victims and the bodies recovered were shown in court, and the prosecutor asked that he be treated how he treated his victims. While in prison, he painted pictures of clowns, skulls, Jesus, and the second dwarves, among other things. Most of his paintings were bought by families of the victims and burnt. He also wrote a book. Most copies were destroyed. On May 10th, people had gathered around his execution set just to watch and to be assured of the death of the American monster. He was to be executed by lethal injection. He was given his last meal: KFC chicken, fried prawns, French fries, strawberries, and a Diet Coke. The crowd gathered just outside had raised their cardboard, clearly showing their displeasure and disgust for John Gacy. Although his execution was delayed due to a clog in the IV tube to be used, at exactly 12:58 that day, he passed from a shot. His last words were, "Kiss my ass." Delving into Gacy's psychology. Peering into the complex and disturbing psyche of John Wayne Gacy, we are confronted with the chilling realization, the depths of darkness that can exist within the seemingly ordinary. Gacy's ability to blend seamlessly into society while harboring such malevolence reminds us of the fragility of our assumptions about others. We are left with a haunting question. How could someone who appeared so ordinary be capable of such unspeakable horrors? Well, that's a wrap for today. Catch us next time as we lay bare the dark side of human nature. Until then, stay safe.
Aren't you afraid sitting that close to me? What the hell? Oh, this is too long. You don't need it this long. Okay. I had a rosary, which I carried in my pocket. I've always carried a rosary. It was my communion rosary. They said, well, what kind of a knot do you use? I said, what do you mean knot? When I tie things up, I